For tonight, I'm outside on my patio. I'm actually sitting by my fire bowl. It's after dark. It's a little breezy, but it's really nice weather, and it feels nice to be outside. Plus, it's a little noisy in the house, and I wanted to get out to record this. So I apologize in advance if there's a little bit of ambient noise. Because it's late enough, we're getting road noise from just outside the neighborhood, and it is a little windy. Somebody's got some wind chimes nearby, and there's just some noise here and there. Whatever. I'm sure it won't make the recording impossible, just a little more difficult than normal. I want to talk about Dungeons and Dragons a little bit, and I specifically want to talk about where I think the conventional wisdom about how to do Dungeons and Dragons and what to do on certain select questions, at least, is actually exactly backwards. I think what you want to do is the opposite of what you normally hear if you go get advice from D&D gurus, longtime players, forums full of players, whatnot. I think you will often get the exact opposite of what you should be getting, and you'll get advice that's the opposite of what you should do. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I know this sounds a little controversial, and I think it probably is. I think that I try to make a distinction between what I like and what I think the majority of players are looking for in the game. Sometimes we align, sometimes we do not, and that's fine, but I'd like to think that I at least am not blind to that. And I think a lot of times when people give you advice, all that they can do is tell you what they want, even if it is esoteric and even if it is the opposite of what you should be doing. And a lot of times people just kind of parrot and repeat stuff that they've heard, and they probably do it at their table too, but their games would be so much better if they didn't, if they turned around and did the opposite. So first off, let's tackle a big issue. I am a strong believer in a hard line between elements that are part of the DM's sovereignty and what is part of the player's sovereignty. And if the player intrudes into the sovereignty of the DM, or vice versa, you are setting yourself up for a lot of disappointment and frustration in your game rather than fun. You need to kind of respect the sovereignty of the other people in your game. Where this comes into play in particular is with character generation. And there's a common bit of wisdom that I hear very frequently, and a lot of GMs believe this very strongly, that it is the player's job collectively to come up with a balanced party that can handle any situation that they might meet in the wider world. And if they don't, that's their fault. And it's their problem. I think, on the other hand, that this is exactly backwards. I think that player sovereignty, one of the few things that player sovereignty is really hard and fast on, there's others too, but this is one of the key ones, is that players have the absolute right to play the character that they want to play. Nobody should be forced to draw the short straw and be the cleric, for example. And in my opinion, very few people really want to play clerics. And some people will dutifully do so, and they're fine, and they think it's fine, and they don't complain about it, and they enjoy it well enough. But it's rarely their first choice, and they would rather have done something else. They're only playing a cleric because they have this belief that if there's not a cleric, then your party's going to fail. You're not going to be able to play the game properly. I think this is entirely wrong-headed. I think that it is important for the GM to make sure that his game is tweaked and tailored so that it fits the group that he gets, not to passive-aggressively punish the group for not conforming to what his idea of the party should be. If he does so, he is intruding into player sovereignty, and the players will be frustrated with that game. That doesn't mean that they won't have a good time. Maybe they will if he's a good DM in other ways. I mean, I got to tell you, I would be incredibly frustrated if I were not able to play the character that I wanted to play, within the bounds of the setting, of course. But if I couldn't pick from the available options because, quote-unquote, had to have a balanced party, oh, well, you didn't have a thief, too bad. You're going to not be able to sneak around and find traps, and you're going to have twice the character death that you would if you had a thief. Stuff like that is, like I said, is passive-aggressive. Don't do it. It is just going to lead to frustration. It's not a good way to run a game. A good way to run a game is to tailor your game to the group that you get. And even if you run prepared stuff, that usually just kind of means a few minor tweaks. It's not hard to do. And if you're not willing to do it, then in my opinion, you're kind of not in the right mindset to run the game. You're not in the right mindset to be a DM. All right, what's another bit of received wisdom that I think that a lot of people have absolutely backwards? This one's maybe a little bit more complex in terms of, is it received wisdom or not? D&D, and I think most people are aware of this and know this, grew out of the wargaming hobby and the wargaming community that people like Dave Arneson and Gary Gygax operated in the 70s. And for a long time, D&D was basically a slightly modified war game. And even today, it carries with it a lot of legacy elements that are rooted in that wargaming paradigm. However, I think most players who play D&D are more interested in other things than they are in war games. And that's not really what they want from D&D. I think most of them came into D&D because they were fans of fantasy fiction, and they read fantasy stories, and they read fantasy books. More recently, or if they're younger, they've seen fantasy movies or fantasy TV shows. And that's what they want their game to resemble more. They don't want it to resemble a war game. They don't want a lot of legacy elements of war games. Now, that doesn't mean that they can't deal with them and aren't, okay with them, but it does mean that if you kind of found a way to change your paradigm of what the game is supposed to be like, you could make them much more happy and deliver much more of what they want from the game, as opposed to baggage that kind of came along with the game that they're not actually interested in. What's an example of this, you may ask? I think one very notable one is actually related to what we just talked to. It has to do with healing magic. There's a problem in the game if there's no healing. It's got to be solved somehow. What has happened over time is that there's this kind of medic that runs around with healing magic, and it's a very gamist solution, and it doesn't feel like it has any antecedent in the literature on which the game is based, the genre on which the game is based. Therefore, it's probably not the best solution, and we should be looking for something else. Now, in my game, I've done something different. I kind of have what I call action movie healing, and it's, just I switch some of the mechanics around. I don't have any clerics. I don't have any healing magic. I've kind of bumped up the utility of healing surges and done some other things to compensate. But by and large, you find that you can run a successful game without clerics, without healing magic. This should be kind of obvious because a lot of other games other than D&D don't have that, and they work fine. But a lot of people think that D&D needs that, and I'm not sure why. Another aspect where that comes into play is with death effects. And a lot of people, especially if you're kind of an old school D&D player, may think that the game isn't very lethal, which is true. It's not. And it's arguable that some of the recent versions of the game have gone too far in that direction. It's actually incredibly difficult to kill players. It's too difficult to kill players. Not that DMs are going out of their way to purposely kill them, of course, but it should be something that there's a risk of that happening. Part of the reason that this has happened, I think, is because players don't want their game to feel like a war game with their characters are nothing more than disposable tokens or tactical pieces. They want to feel like there's enough continuity of character that they can kind of play the game out as if it were an ensemble cast of an episodic TV show like X-Files or Supernatural or Lost or something like that, Walking Dead, I don't know, there's a ton of examples. They want it to feel like The Lord of the Rings. They want it to feel like, a million other books that they've probably read. And, in those kind of things, what you would consider, I guess, maybe to be player characters do kind of die. Lord of the Rings has Boromir die, for example. It has, a number of other players who are relatively important do die. In The Hobbit, a lot of characters die there at the end that I would consider probably the equivalent of player characters. So it's okay for player characters to die, but you don't want it to be too frequent. You want to make it always a risk, but you don't want to make it a high probability. So, one example of this is kind of the idea of negative hit points versus you're dead at 0 hit points. A lot of people prefer dead at 0 hit points. They think it makes more sense, and they kind of like the fact that it changes the tactical incentives, I guess, of the game and makes the game play differently. And it does certainly make the game more dangerous. If I were to adopt that in my game, I would probably have a character die every session, maybe more. And, granted, they would adjust their tactics eventually and be better at it, but I'd still kill a lot of players. And I don't want to change the way that I run, because I think that that's an important part of making it feel like the type of genre that I'm trying to emulate. So it's important, therefore, that I have a mechanic that gives players a buffer so they don't die quite so often. So that, 4 out of 5 times that they might die, they actually don't. The 5th time that they do. And that's how they learn to be careful, because there's always the risk that you die. It's just that instead of a 100% risk that nobody finishes the game with the character they start with, that 4 out of 5 people do. Or some number in that kind of range. You know what I mean? I think that is again driven by the fact that players don't come at this from a wargaming paradigm. They don't want the game to feel like a war game. I think another aspect where this happens is in sandbox versus railroad. This has been a long discussion for many, many years about sandboxes versus railroads. The reality, of course, is that it's not a binary choice. Those are probably 2 endpoints on a spectrum of play that includes a lot of different things. And there's a lot of things to be borrowed from sandboxes. There's a few things to be borrowed from railroads here and there, believe it or not. Not a lot, because railroads are deservedly have a reputation for being frustrating for players. But in my opinion, and in my experience, more importantly, most players are just as frustrated with a sandbox as they are with a railroad. And part of this again goes back to the wargaming versus fiction avenue into the hobby. If you are a wargamer, or were a wargamer, then the sandbox is great, because you're just kind of exploring hexes and stuff's randomized even quite often. And there doesn't need to be any context or much context to hang it all together, because that's not the point. I don't think very many people enjoy that type of game, though. In fact, I think a lot of people, if presented with a sandbox, would be really frustrated at all the time that they spent wandering around trying to find where the game is. This is especially true for characters who don't have a handle on the setting. They don't really understand what your setting is like necessarily, or where stuff is, or what's in it, and what it's all about. And they don't have much of a handle on their characters yet. What I prefer is what I call, and I didn't coin this term, a guy that I used to, he was a friend. I don't see him anymore. We used to be mostly we hung out online rather than in person. He lived halfway across the country from me, and I don't hang out in those online forums anymore, and I don't think he does either, to be honest with you. So I don't want to say he's not a friend, as in I don't like him anymore. He's just, I've lost touch with him. But he's the guy who coined this, and he calls it the narrow, wide, narrow model. And how this works is when you start a campaign off, you do kind of present the characters with fewer and more obvious hooks for them to follow. And the expectation is that they will follow them and play along, and not be stubborn and be like, I don't want to do that, I want to do something else. And you kind of let them get drawn into the setting this way, and you gradually start throwing more hooks towards them and see what they bite on. And over time, over a few sessions, it takes a few sessions to get there, but over time you get to the point where you don't need to drive the setting as the GM anymore. Yeah, they get to the point where they can kind of drive the game. They have their own goals. They understand who the players are, so to speak, the non-player players, if you will, and they understand what's going on in the setting, so they can drive it. But you gotta build up to it. You don't just jump headfirst into a sandbox, because nobody knows what to do with that. Very few players know what to do with that. And frankly, I don't think very many players want that out of their game either, because it's too random and there is no context, and it doesn't feel like anything that they're used to from the genre. They want some hooks. They want some nemesis characters that you have kind of crafted for them, who have plots going on that they can kind of try and foil. They want scenarios that feel like the plots of their favorite TV shows translated into fantasy and stuff like that. You know what I mean? That's what players want, most of them. So you give them, for the majority of the campaign, you give them wide berth. You give them a lot of room to drive things themselves. But at the beginning, you kind of give them a narrow kind of stretch that they have to go through, where you do a little bit more of the driving until they kind of realize what there is to do in the setting and what they can do. As you get closer to the end of your campaign, you need to start narrowing it again. You need to start closing off open hooks. You need to start having satisfying conclusions to these arcs that have developed organically through improvisation over the course of the entire campaign. But but you don't want them to feel like that's, you want the players to feel like they were in control, but you want somehow the end result to feel like you had some kind of master plan that worked out really well. And the way to do that is you kind of start closing these off at the end, and you lead towards a satisfying finale where, you know, again, as the GM, you probably are going to take a little bit more active role in making the game play out the way that you want it to. So I think there's this kind of almost a fetish sometimes in the community about sandbox games, and they equate sandbox with good and railroad with bad. I don't think that's true at all. I think that's terrible advice. I think sandboxes have some elements that are, you know, everybody would do well to look at them and say, you know, how can I make this work in my game? But nobody really wants a platonic ideal of a sandbox. And I think that it is in fact just as frustrating to most players as a railroad is. In fact, ironically, I think more people are less frustrated with railroads than you would think. If they weren't, why in the world do most people run published modules with a pretty railroady story built in? It's because most people actually don't mind railroads as much as common wisdom says that they do. They actually kind of prefer them. In fact, a lot of players don't even want to think about anything other than, okay, just roll some dice, do some combat, have some tactics maybe, and then everything in between is just the filler to get to the next combat. And, you know, that's kind of one extreme, I guess. But I think even you're just your normal player, they want to have the game presented to them. They don't want to have to try and find it or build it from scratch. Although, if as a GM you can get them engaged and active enough that they do drive the game by setting their own goals and kind of making their own decisions about what exactly to go do and what to pursue, that's a desirable state of affairs. But, you know, that's different than just, okay, you're standing at the inn, which way do you go? And it's kind of like, well, I don't know. I mean, you know, I have all these choices, but none of them mean anything to me because I have no knowledge of the setting. You know, if I go left or I go right, well, that's not a meaningful choice if I know absolutely nothing about what's different between left and right. It becomes a false choice. I mean, I can make it, but who cares? What difference does it make if I choose one or the other? Because I don't know. I don't have any information to base that decision on. And I think that's kind of the problem with most sandbox games. I think with the narrow, wide, narrow model, you approach something more like a sandbox in your kind of the middle, wide section. And that's good, but you can't just do just that without anything else, in my opinion. And again, that's comes back to the vector in which, how did you get into the hobby? Did you get in it through wargaming, or did you get in it through fantasy fiction that you were reading? Yeah, another interesting question. I don't know if this is exactly received wisdom or if there is no wisdom on this at all, but a couple things that I see quite frequently. A lot of people want to have more elements of horror in their game, and I'm a huge fan of the horror genre being integrated into D&D. I consider almost everything that I have run for 10 or 15 years to belong to the dark fantasy genre, if you will, which is basically a hybrid of heroic fantasy and horror. And so horror is a key element in what I run. However, I think that you can't do horror in D&D. I know that's an interesting thing to say, but I don't think you can. D&D is not generic. A lot of people say D&D is generic fantasy. It's not generic. It is, however, broad. And the difference is that D&D can be used for a lot of different kind of tones, a lot of different type of games, but it's still, you can't do it for everything. It's not that generic. There's a lot of things that are very specific to D&D, and they're D&D-isms, and if you don't have D&D specifically in mind as you're running that game, it's probably going to fail. It's going to fight against the system. It's going to fight against the assumptions built into the mechanics. It's going to fight against the expectations that the players have, and it's going to fight against. It's going to fall kind of flat, and it's not going to work. So, in my opinion, if you really want to do like real horror, you need to get a different system that's tailored to it. And it's arguable how well horror works role-playing game environment, to be honest with you, at all, except as short campaigns or even one-shots. But what I think most people really want to do is they want D&D that has some horror flavor, and I think that that's a totally different question. But I think the first thing to keep in mind is that, first off, you got to make sure that it's still D&D. Otherwise, you're gonna struggle, and then you need to find ways to integrate this horror into D&D without making D&D into something that it's not, or trying to make D&D into something it's not, and then and then, you know, bumping your head against the brick wall of the mechanics and the system and the expectations of everybody involved. So I think one way to do this is to be very careful about how you handle monsters. In D&D, monsters are generally considered kind of routine, to be honest with you. I mean, you've got a third of the rules. The entire book is nothing but monsters. Every module, adventure, or, you know, whatever you want to call it, that I've ever read and seen printed, even the shorter ones, probably have close to a dozen different types of monsters in them. Maybe not the really short ones, but you know what I'm saying, is monsters are pretty routine. Your typical D&D character runs across several monsters every single day on his commute to work. And that is the exact opposite of what horror needs to be. Monsters can never be random. Monsters can never be routine. They don't just pop up and, you know, oh, hey, it's a monster, you know, because why not? It's D&D. You expect monsters all the time. If you do that, it simply will not be horror at all. Monsters need to be treated as elaborate set pieces. A monster, in fact, the very presence of a monster should almost imply almost an entire module's worth of content. And you've got to really build up to it. There's got to be a lot more going on before you actually see the monster. There has to be a lot of foreshadowing. There has to be preparation. There has to be, you know, dread created. There has to be a tone of, you know, oh no, what is out there and why is it, you know, so dangerous and so fearsome. And that is an important part of making monster appearances be successful. And if you can do that, the monster itself doesn't even have to necessarily be super impressive. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes just the fact that you were able to build up to it can make a routine monster seem not routine and make it seem really kind of memorable. And I've occasionally had really good luck with that and done it very well. I think I sometimes have done it a little bit more intuitively rather than purposefully. But to me, that's one of the key elements of bringing horror into D&D. And you'll never have a horror D&D game. I'm sorry, Ravenloft, you know, can't really be done, in my opinion, except as a brief outing where you kind of dabble your toes in gothic horror or whatever. And that doesn't mean that horror elements can't be an important part of the game, but you're not really going to have the horror genre because D&D is ultimately a heroic fantasy game, and ultimately it doesn't really work for anything else. Which is another tangent. What exactly is the genre of D&D? I said it's broad, lots of different tones, lots of different styles, lots of different things you can do with D&D, but you can't do everything. What exactly is it designed to do? There are a lot of people who say it's designed for high fantasy. There's a lot of good reasons why they think that that's true. There's a lot of people that say it's designed for sword and sorcery, and there's a lot of good reasons why they think that that's true. What a lot of people don't necessarily recognize is that while, you know, you could make a point that D&D straddles a line somewhere between those two subgenres, there's another third or so of D&D that doesn't resemble either one. In fact, it doesn't resemble anything other than itself. And D&D has, over the years, become increasingly self-referential. And it isn't high fantasy, it isn't sword and sorcery, it isn't anything except for D&D itself. And it is, you know, just kind of its own thing that doesn't resemble anything. I don't know that I'm necessarily taking umbrage with the received wisdom here, other than that I don't know how many people recognize that fact, to be honest with you, and I think that they should. Personally, I kind of prefer my fantasy role-playing without the overt D&D-isms because it kind of honestly takes me out a little bit of the setting to think about the overt D&D-ism that I'm seeing, because they always feel like game mechanics to me when I see them. And in part that's because that's how they were originally designed. And so I don't know, I think that there's room for homebrewing of the system a little more than people think. And I think there's room for homebrewing even some of the basic setting assumptions more than people think, because if you don't do that, not only is D&D not generic, but it's very recognizable as exactly it's just D&D. It just feels like D&D. And you know, a lot of people think that there's big differences between Greyhawk and Forgotten Realms and Eberron and I don't know, some other setting. In my opinion, there's not. Those are all basically the same in most respects, and the differences between them are mostly superficial and unimportant. Eberron's maybe a little bit different than Greyhawk and Forgotten Realms, which are much more similar to each other. You know, the reality is that all of them are still so steeped in self-referentialism of D&D that they just don't feel like anything other than D&D. In fact, I think that Eberron in particular kind of struggled with an interesting thing here in that it was kind of trying to be something else. The precis of the setting is one that doesn't feel quite like D&D, and maybe D&D wasn't really the best setting, or the system rather, for that setting. Now, I really like Eberron, don't get me wrong. I think Eberron's one of my favorite D&D settings, but I think it would actually have been even better were it done as maybe a Savage World setting or something, and they kind of didn't feel the need to be so D&D-ish occasionally. And I think that the mechanics of Eberron, well, the mechanics of the game when Eberron was in print, I should say, the 3rd edition and later the 4th edition, actually also fought against the tone that Eberron was trying to establish, and it kind of sabotaged itself. It was trying to say, here's my tone, but my system doesn't match it at all. So I think, again, I'm not entirely sure that this is do the opposite of the received wisdom. I think one needs to be aware, though, and I think maybe many players are not. D&D is not generic. It is sort of broad, but it is not generic. And it's okay to change things to make it feel less like standard D&D. In fact, it's often desirable because the differences will stand out. It'll really kind of make it work for you. And in many cases, if you don't do that, you will find yourself kind of stuck in a D&D mentality that doesn't allow you to do what maybe you're trying to do with your setting or your game. The last question I'm going to address is high level. And I think at a subconscious level, and maybe even at a conscious level, actually a lot of people know this, but a lot of people are in denial about it as well. High level in any version of D&D that I've ever been familiar with, from the beginning to the current, doesn't work very well. It is a broken kind of mess. It's usually not very fun. Part of the problem too that it has is that it literally is a different genre than low-level D&D, and frankly, for that matter, mid-level D&D is kind of a different genre altogether. High-level D&D often feels more like the Justice League or the Avengers in fantasy, and is a totally different game than low-level D&D, which can feel much more like a survival horror almost sometimes, especially if you're playing with some of the older versions of the rules. And that's fine. In fact, in some ways, it makes high level something that you want to play. You want to try it because you look at it and you say, you can do all these things in high level that you can't do at other levels, and it sounds really fun. Even if I don't do it all the time, it sounds fun that I kind of want to do that sometimes. I want to travel to the abyss and stand toe-to-toe with demon lords and all this other jazz that sounds really cool and exciting. Unfortunately, it just doesn't work. The game mechanics are very tedious. They don't work very well. There's too much going on. This is especially true with some of the later versions of the game, 3rd edition in particular, but I think 4th edition too. You had so many different things that you had to track that it just became this incredibly frustrating accounting chore to play the game at high level, which wasn't fun, obviously, and very few people find accounting fun. Don't tell my son I said that. He gets offended. But not only was that not very fun, but it also just didn't work very well. And the things that you kind of expected to have happen didn't work very well. The game became very swingy. You knew who was going to win a combat within the first few rounds, but then you still had to spend a lot of time attrition to get the massive amount of hit points to just go down. I mean, there was just a lot of things that made it tedious. In my opinion, unfortunately, as fun as high level sounds like it could be, the payoff isn't worth it. I recommend not playing high level at all. I recommend deliberately planning on ending your campaigns before you get there. Well, what if you want this campaign that kind of goes on and plays for years? People talk about that and it sounds really great and exciting and fun. I kind of agree, although I also kind of think that most campaigns benefit from having a planned end that isn't too far out there, lingering on and on. But if you want it to last longer, you can certainly and should certainly slow down the level progression considerably. There's nothing about D&D that says you need to go from 1st to 3rd or 4th level in your first adventure. There's nothing about D&D that suggests that it is important to the game itself that, you know, after a month of play, you're pushing 10th level. To be honest with you, the way I would do progression, and I don't use experience points. I'm actually not interested in experience points. What I'm interested in is I decide as a GM to level the PCs when I'm ready to level them. And they kind of stay at the level that they're at until they're kind of done with whatever I want them to do at that level, or whatever they want to do at that level. However, you know, we collectively kind of get to the point where, okay, now we're feeling like this level is now played out, let's move on. And I kind of always have planned on my games going to a 10th level max, and sometimes not even that high by design. And that's just, you know, you get that far, then the game's it's gonna be over one way or another. It's gonna end before you get there. Either because we planned it that way, or because trying to play at that point starts to become tedious and not fun, and we all kind of lose interest and the game falls apart, which unfortunately I've seen happen all too often. Wizards of the Coast actually published some research, or mentioned some research. They didn't publish it. They mentioned, some of their employees have mentioned some research that suggests that very few people play at high level, or even for that matter, relative to low level, they play at mid levels even. Most people start a lot of campaigns, and a lot of them are kind of abortive. They don't finish them the way that they're supposed to, and then they just start another one later. And even if they do manage to keep them running, very few of them, you know, go at very high level. And there's various reasons why a campaign could end. Sometimes it's just, you know, people lose interest in it for whatever reason. Sometimes it's because, you know, schedules conflict, somebody moves away, and the whole group just kind of loses its cohesion, and it becomes difficult. But a lot of times people they deliberately don't play high level. And that's what I recommend you do. And it is kind of a shame, because you look at a lot of high level stuff and you say, that looks really exciting, that looks really cool. I'd love to find a way to use that. Like I said, I just don't think the payoff is worth it. The price is too high, the payoff is too small. You're better served spending your time in level ranges that are more fun. Anyway, I'm sure there's other things I could think of, but I've talked enough. Let's stop here, and we'll see if anybody even finds this video, and if so, if they have any comments about it.